Hi, my name is NORHIDAYATI BINTI IDZUDIN and I will be presenting Introduction. ISO 9001 is the internationally recognized standard for quality management system (QMS). The standard is applied by the organization to improve the quality of their products and services and consistently meet their customers' expectations. ISO 14001 is the international standard for environmental management system (EMS). Its principle specifies the requirements for the formulation and maintenance of an EMS. The standard include issues such as establishment, implementation, maintenance, and improvement of an EMS. And ISO 45001 is the new ISO standard for the occupational health and safety (OHS) and is set to improve the levels of workplace safety. The standard target to provide a safe and safety workplace for employees and visitors. I will be presenting Clause 4, Context of the Organization. Clause 4.1, Understanding the Organization and its Context. ISO 9001, 14001, and 45001 share the same purpose, which is the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and its strategic direction and that affect its ability to achieve their intended results. For ISO 9001, the organization shall monitor and review information about these external and internal issues. For ISO 14001, issues shall include environmental conditions being affected by or capable of affecting the organization. Clause 4.2, Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. For ISO 9001, due to the effect or potential effect on the organization's ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, the organization shall determine the interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system and determine the requirements of these interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. The organization shall monitor and review information about these interested parties and their relevant requirements. For ISO 14001, the organization shall determine the interested parties that are relevant to the environmental management system. Determine the relevant and needs expectations of these interested parties, which of these needs and expectations becomes its compliance obligations. And for ISO 45001, the organization shall determine the other interested parties in addition to workers that are relevant to OHS management system and determine the relevant needs and expectations to workers and interested parties, which could become legal requirements and other requirements. Clause 4.t, Determining the scope of the quality management system. For ISO 9001, 14001, and 45001, all the organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of their management system to establish its scope, and the scope shall be available and maintained as documented information. When determining the scope, the organization shall consider, for ISO 9001, the organization shall consider the external and internal issues, the requirements of relevant interested parties in understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, and the products and services of organization. For ISO 14001, the organization shall consider the external and internal issues, the compliance obligations, the organizational units, functions and physical boundaries, its activities and product services, and its authority and ability to exercise control and influence. For ISO 45001, the organization shall consider the external and internal issues, the requirement on understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, the plan or perform work-related activities. Clause 4.4, QMS, EMS, and OH and SMS. The organization shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve their management system, including the process needed and their interactions with the requirement of international standard. For Clause 4.4.1, in ISO 9001, the organization shall determine the processes needed for QMS and their application of the organizations, and also determine input and the output required, the sequence and interactions of processes, the resources needed, apply the criteria and method, address the risks and opportunities, improve the processes and QMS, and more. For 4.2.2, the extent necessary, the organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of processes, retain documented information for the processes, work as planned.
Assalamualaikum and hi to everyone. My name is NURHIDAYATI HANISAH binti ANUAR from class AS2291B. My ID number is 2022991411. I will present about the similarity and difference of ISO 19001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. I will be more specific about this topic on class 5, which is leadership and commitment. I will start with 5.1, which is leadership and commitment. We will see the similarity between ISO 9001, ISO 40001, and ISO 45001. So, how do top management demonstrate leadership and commitment? Firstly, they promote continual improvement. Next is by taking the accountability of the effectiveness of the system. Furthermore, they will ensure that the policy and objectives are established and compatible with the strategic direction. They also will ensure the context of the organization. Last but not least, they will ensure that the integration, resource needed, and intent outcomes that an organization need to achieve. Let's proceed with 5.2, which is organizational policy. We will see the difference between ISO 19001, ISO 40001, and ISO 45001. Starting with ISO 9001, that state the top management will establish, implement, and maintain a quality policy. They also will help meet the needs of their customers and other stakeholders more effectively. However, for ISO 40001, state that the policy of the environmental system need to appropriate to the purpose and content of the organization, but includes the nature, scale, and environmental impacts of its activity, product, and service. For ISO 40001, state that they will include the commitment they provide and healthy working condition for the prevention of the related injury and ill health. They appropriate to the purpose, size, and contents of the organization to the specific nature of its occupational health and safety, risks, and opportunities. We will proceed to the 5.3, which is organization roles, responsibility, and authorities. We will see the difference between ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. I will start with ISO 90001. In this ISO, we can see in the table that they are ensured that the responsibility and authorities for the relevant roles are assigned, communicated, and understood within the organization. But for ISO 40001, state that they ensure the responsibility and authority for relevant roles are assigned and communicated within the environmental management system organization. They also ensure that system conform to the requirements of the international standard. Now, let's see what is ISO 40001 state for their responsibility and authorities. ISO 45001 will do that within the occupational health and safety management system are assigned and communicate at all levels within the organization and maintain all document information. In addition, for ISO 9001 also will ensure quality management system is maintained when change to the quality management system are planned and implemented. In ISO 40001, we can see in the last point from the table that workers should report on the performance of the environmental management system, including environmental performance to top management. However, it is different with ISO 45001, which is workers shall assume responsibility for those aspects of the occupational health and safety management system over which they have control. That is all from me for similarity and difference of ISO 9001, ISO 40001, and ISO 45001 in class 5. Thank you for listening.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is ANNALYA BINTI and I will be presenting the similarities and differences of class 6, planning. First and foremost, I will be talking about the similarities of ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. These clauses are driven by establishing a process to determine risks, manage them, and identify opportunities to improve. The risks and opportunities should be relevant to the context of the organization as well as any interested parties. Moving on, I will be talking about the differences between them. In 6.1.1 General of ISO 9001, planning is the process of conceptualizing the activity required to achieve the desired goal. Although risk and opportunity have to be determined and addressed, there is no requirement in ISO 9001 for a formal, documented risk management process or risk metrics. The organization has a methodology in place that enables them to effectively identify risks and opportunities with respect to the planning of its management system. In ISO 14001, planning is integral to all elements of an environmental management system. The intention of Clause 6.1.1 is to ensure that the organization is able to achieve the intended outcomes of the environmental management system, prevent or reduce undesired effects, and achieve continual improvement. Planning should be a collaborative effort, involving personnel from different levels and functions, sends message that environmental performance is the responsibility and concern of all within the organization, regardless of job title. In ISO 45001, planning is an integral part of all elements of an OH&S management system. Effective planning is concerned with prevention by identifying, eliminating, and controlling hazards and risks. This is particularly important when dealing with health risks, which might only become apparent after long gestation period. Planning should be a collaborative effort involving personnel throughout the organization as well. Next is 6.1.2 Environmental Aspect and Hazard Identification. For ISO 14001, the organization will need to determine the environmental aspects that relate to activities, products, and services within the scope of its environmental management system. Organizations are responsible for, first, identifying associated environmental impacts of products, activities, and services. Second, considering the life cycle perspective with respect to environmental impacts within supply chain, environmental impacts associated with product use, and environmental impacts of end-of-life treatment and disposal. Third is maintaining documented information regarding environmental aspects and significant impacts. Fourth, prioritizing issues that could affect intended outcomes, for example, enhancement of environmental performance and fulfillment of compliance obligation. For ISO 45001, the overall purpose of the risk assessment process is to evaluate the hazards that arise or might arise in the course of the organization's activity and ensure that the risks to people arising from these hazards are assessed, prioritized, and controlled to eliminate hazards or reduce risk to acceptable levels. Hazards have the potential to cause injury or ill health. They need to be identified before the risks associated with this hazard can be assessed, and if no controls exist or existing controls are inadequate, effective controls should be implemented according to the hierarchy of controls. Identified hazards and their potential consequences must be documented and fed into the risk assessment processes. The hazard identification process should consider all possible hazards that may exist within the scope of the operation and activities, including interfaces with other systems, both within and external to the organization. After that is 6.1.3 Compliance Obligation, Legal and Other Requirements. In ISO 14001, the organization should have a process to determine the compliance obligations that are related to its environmental aspects. Obligations may arise from mandatory requirements, applicable laws and regulations, voluntary commitments such as organizational and industry standards, contractual relationships, principle of good governance, and community and ethical standards. However, in ISO 45001, the organization should have a process to determine and have access to health and safety legal requirements and other requirements applicable to its OHSMS, and to determine how these requirements apply to them. Legal requirements can result in risk opportunities to the organization and may arise from mandatory requirements, applicable laws and regulation, voluntary commitments such as organizational and industry standards, contractual relationships, principle of good governance, and community and ethical standards. It is better to maintain documented information on legal and other requirements. Furthermore is 6.1.4 Planning Action. In ISO 14001, the organization should ensure that specific plans are in place to address risks and opportunities that have been assessed as requiring further action, address compliance obligations, and prepare for response to emergency situations. In ISO 45001, the organization should ensure that specific plans are in place to address risks and opportunities that have been assessed as requiring further action, address legal and other requirements, and prepare for response to emergency situations. Moving on to 6.2.1 Quality, Environmental, and OH&S Objectives. In ISO 9001, the organization should establish objectives in order to maintain the policies, including the commitment to prevention of pollution and continual improvement. In ISO 14001, the organization should establish objectives in order to maintain and improve the environmental management system that aligns the policies with strategic and management system. The organization should maintain documented EMS objectives and targets at each relevant function and level within the organization. The objectives and target must be consistent with the EMS policies, including the commitment to prevention of pollution and continual improvement. In ISO 45001, the organization should establish objectives in order to maintain and improve the OH&S management system and to achieve continual improvement in its OH&S performance. An effectively implemented OH&S management system provides the framework upon which to translate this objective into functional targets. The goal-oriented framework allows the goals established at the uppermost level of the organization to flow down through integrated management system to influence functional and personal objectives and targets. In addition, all three ISOs, depending on size, management structure, and other factors pertaining to the organization, the objectives may be established and reviewed by various personnel and with direct top management input. Other than that is 6.2.2 Planning Actions to Achieve Quality Objectives. In ISO 9001, organizations must undertake planning in order to determine how their management system objectives will be achieved. The planning includes determining the work required in order for the organization to realize its objectives should look for evidence that effective planning is taking place to support the achievement of the organization's objective. In ISO 14001, organizations must undertake planning in order to determine how their EMS objectives will be achieved. This planning includes determining the work required in order for the organization to realize its objectives should look for evidence that effective planning is taking place to support the achievement of the organization's objective. In ISO 45001, organizations are required to establish and maintain one or more management improvement programs for achieving their objectives. The management improvement program is a key element to the success of the OHSMS. Properly designed and implemented, management system programs should achieve the objectives and also improve the organization's performance. Last but not least, 6.3, Planning for Change. In ISO 9001, this is a new requirement for ensuring that once the processes are determined and their sequence are documented within the quality manual, organizations should identify the risks and opportunities associated with these processes. In order to realize the benefits associated with the identified risks and opportunities, subsequent changes to the management system may be needed. These changes could relate to any aspect of any process, such as its input, resources, suppliers, personnel, activities, control management, and output. That is all from me. Thank you.
Hi and Assalamualaikum. My name is NURHIDAYATUL HANANI binti ARIPIN. I am from AS 229 to A. So today I will present my topic for Class 7, which is support for EBT 472. So first of all, I would like to apologize on my unclear appearance since something bad happened to my eyes last night and I need to cover it for some reason. So shall we start now? Supports are classified into 5 parts, which is resources, competence, awareness, communication, and documented information. The resources needed to establish the implementation. There are 3 ISO here, which is ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. So the differentiation between 3 ISO is, for the ISO 9011, the resources are classified as people, infrastructure, environment for the operation of the process, monitoring, measuring, resources, and organization knowledge. And then for the ISO 14001, the resources are classified as infrastructure, external provided resources, information system, competence technology, and also financial and humans. And for the ISO 45001, the resources are included human, natural, infrastructure, technology, and also financial. Next, we go for 7.2, which is understanding the competence for each ISO. So for the ISO 9001, the organization shall determine the necessity of the competence of a person's doing work under its control, that it affects the environmental and performance. It is also its ability to fulfill the compliance of the obligation. And then for the ISO 14001, the organization's control who affect its environment performance included the persons. So who works as the potential to cause the significant environmental impact, who are assigned the responsibilities for the environment management, and then who are including those who respond to the emergency situation, perform internal, and many more examples for the organization of the competence, which ISO 14001, which is I state here only 3. The competence for ISO 45001, the competence of the worker should include the knowledge and skill needed to approximately and identify the hazard and deal with the organization risks associated with their work and their workplace. Next is understanding the awareness for 7.3 support. For ISO 9001, the organization shall ensure the person works under the organization's control are aware of quality policy, relevant objective and target, their contribution to the effectiveness of QMS, and the lastly is implementation of the comforting QMS. Next is for ISO 14001. The organization shall ensure that all the workers and all the organization are control aware of the environmental policy, the significant environmental aspect and related indirect and potential environmental impacts associated with their environment work. And then they also need to aware about their contribution to the effectiveness of aware EMS. They also need to aware the implication of not comforting with EMS requirement, including not to fulfilling the organization's compliance obligations. And for the ISO 45001, workers should aware that their contribution to the effectiveness of OSH management system, including the benefits of OSH performance. They need to aware that they need to be effective to the OSH. Next is understanding the communication for 7.4 support. For ISO 9001 EMS 2015, the organization must decide what and when with whom and how to communicate both internally and externally. Problem may arise due to incomplete, biggest inaccurate system or information. So they need to determine the internal and external communication relevant to the quality management system. Next, for the ISO 14001, the communication are classified into 2, which is internal and external. So for the internal, internally communicate the information relevant to the EMS among the various levels and function of the organization. They must ensure that the communication process are enabled for the person that work under the organization control, so it will improve their contribution. And then for the external, so for the external, it must ensure that its communication process are enabled to the person doing work under the organization control. And then for the ISO 45001, the organization should establish the implementation, maintain the process of the needed external communication. They also need to know the relevant to the OSH, and then including the determine what, when, how, and to whom they will communicate to. The last topic for clause 7, which is the understanding of the documented information. For ISO 14001, it's divided into 3 categories, which is general, creating and update, and control and information. For the general part, documented information required by these international standards. Documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the EMS. For creating an update, the identification and the description format and media must be reviewed and approval for the substantiability and adequacy. And control for the documented information. For the control of documented information, the organization shall address the following activeness as applicable. Then for the ISO 9001, the documented information shall be controlled and available and suitable for us and also adequate protected. This information documented also must be controlled and maintained. That's all. And the last is for the ISO 45001, the organization shall include a description to the main element of OSH management system in process, their interaction, and reference to related documented information. Documented information determined by the organization as being.
Assalamualaikum to Dr. Sabarina. My name is Syahirah binti Zakariah, and I will continue this presentation with the next clause, which is clause 8, which focus on operation. So the first clause is 8.1, which focus on operational plan and control. For the ISO 9001, the organization shall plan, implement, and control the process needed to meet requirement for the provision of product and service, and to implement the action determined in clause 6. While for ISO 14001, the organization shall establish, implement, control, and maintain the process needed to meet environmental management system requirement, and to implement the action to address risk and opportunity as identified in 6.1, and implement action to meet environmental objective as identified in clause 6.2. And while for ISO 45001, the organization shall plan, implement, control, and maintain the process needed to meet requirement of the OHS management system, and to implement the action determined in clause 6. So remember, for ISO 9001, the keyword is plan, while for ISO 14001, the keyword is establish and maintain, while for ISO 45001, the keyword is plan and maintain. We go to the next differentiate. For ISO 9001, plan change are required to be controlled, and action is taken to mitigate the effect of unintended consequence of change. While for ISO 40001, plan and unplanned change should be addressed to ensure that the unintended consequence of this change do not have a negative effect on the intended outcome of the environmental management system. While for ISO 45001, any requirement for its assessment, operational control should be determined in form of timely frequency and regular function, and the action and outputs from this function are undertaken in the correct manner to ensure your system yields the improvement it needs. So what is the similarity of these three ISO? It can be said that the similarity of these three ISO is the organization shall establish operating criteria for the process and implementing control of the process in accordance with the criteria. Okay, now we move to the next clause in clause 8, which is 8.2, which focus on emergency preparedness and response. For ISO 14001, the organization must establish, implement, and maintain the process needed to prepare for and respond to potential emergency situation as identified in 6.1.1. While for ISO 45001, the organization must establish, implement, and maintain a process needed to prepare for and respond to potential emergency situation as identified in 6.1.2 and .1. When talking about the document, for ISO 14001, it should maintain document information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the process is carried out as planned. While for ISO 45001, it should maintain and retain documented information on the process and on the plans for responding to potential emergency situation, including the provision of first aid and training. As we can see in this table, for ISO 9001, the clause 8.2 is focused on requirement for product and service. This is because in this ISO, it focuses more about the quality management system that help organization meet the needs of their customer. Hence, it has requirement for product and service, which are different from the other ISO operation. For their operation, the organization shall ensure that it has the ability to meet the requirement for the product and service to be offered to customers. Second, the organization shall conduct a review before committing to supply product and service to a customer. Then, communication with customers shall include providing information relating to product and service, and they must determine the requirement for the service to be offered to the customer. So that's all from me, and thank you for watching Dr. Sabarina, and I will pass this presentation to the next person.
Assalamualaikum, I'm ARIANA NATASHA and I'm going to continue to class 9, which is performance evaluation. In general, ISO 9001 stated that the organization shall evaluate the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system, while ISO 14001 stated that the organization shall ensure that calibrated and verified monitoring and management equipment is used and maintained as appropriate. Lastly, ISO 45001 stated that the organization shall evaluate the organization health and safety management system. Next is evaluation of compliance. ISO 9001 is responsible to monitor the customer's perception of degree of which their needs and expectation to be fulfilled. ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 are responsible to establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed to evaluate fulfillment of its compliance obligation and evaluation compliance with legal requirements respectively. For analysis and evaluation, only ISO 9001 that is used to analyze and evaluate appropriate data and information arising from monitoring and measurement. Moving on to 9.2, which is internal audit. In general, both of ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 stated that the organization shall conduct internal audits at planned interval to provide information whether the environmental management system conforms to the following terms for ISO 14001 and whether the organization health and safety management system conforms to the following terms for ISO 45001. Continuing to the internal audit program. For ISO 9001, by taking into consideration of importance of the process concerned and results of the previous audits, the audit program should be planned, established, implemented, and maintained, including 6 of the elements stated in the table. Meanwhile, ISO 14001 stated that results of the audits are reported to the relevant management. Lastly, relevant audit results for ISO 45001 are reported to the workers and, where they exist, workers' representatives and other relevant parties. Ending clause 9 with the management review, ISO 9001 stated 2 elements which are input and output. For input, the management review shall be carried out by considering the status of action from the previous management reviews and changes in external and internal issues. The output include decision and action that are related to opportunities for improvement and any need for the changes to the quality management system. ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 mention that the top management shall review the organization's environmental management system and organization health and safety management system respectively, both at planned intervals by considering the following terms mentioned in the table.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is NAJWA AMANI binti KHARUDIN from AS2292A. So, in my turn, I will be presenting about the differences and similarity of ISO 90001, 14001, and 45001 in clause of 10, which is improvement. There are 3 subclauses of clause 10, which is general, non-conformity and corrective action, and the last one is continual improvement. So, in subclause 10.1, which is general, on my research, these 3 of ISO doesn't have the similarity. There are only have the differences, which is as stated in this slide. Alright, now we move on to the next subclause, which is 10.2, non-conformity and corrective action. On my own reading, there are only 2 ISO that have similarity, which is ISO 90001 and ISO 40001. These 2 ISO mention 4 points. Firstly, when non-conformities occur, react to them by controlling, correcting, or dealing with the consequences. Secondly, determine what the cause of the non-conformity and take actions. Third, corrective action will often require updating during planning. Lastly, the records of non-conformities actually taken and the results of those actions must be kept. However, there are differences for ISO 45001, the subclause 10.2 ISO 45001 mentioning about the incident, non-conformity and corrective action. Thus, there are 3 points that have been stated as in this slide. So, the last subclause is 10.3, which is continual improvement. On my reading, there are 2 similarities that I found in ISO 90001 and 14001, which is the organization should continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality and environment management system. The rate, extent, and timescale of action that support continual improvement are determined by the organization itself. However, for ISO 90001 also mentioned that the organization must consider the results of analysis and evaluation and the outputs from management review. Last but not least, for ISO 45001, it's mentioning about the organization should take action to achieving improvement by enhancing occupational health and safety performance. Secondly, by communicating the relevant result of continual improvement to workers. Third, by promoting a culture that provides support to the occupational health safety management system. And the last one is maintaining and retaining documented information, evidence of continual improvement. So I guess that's all from us. Thank you for taking time listening to our presentation.